On the first of the series, I have the privilege of chatting with Jonathan Cox, aka Jono, a well-known legend in the pet food industry who spends his time in and around pet food nutrition, manufacturing, and of course, touches packaging with his clients. So for people who haven't met you before, how do you introduce yourself and what do you do?
Thank you for the very, very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me along. It's great to be here. Look, I guess at its heart, I mean, at the risk of using a sporting metaphor, I've always considered myself to be a utility player. And I've done that through my employment. And I've definitely done that now through my consulting career. So I kind of support companies that be they in the food and particularly pet foods, an area of specialty for me. But I do that in a range of roles that can be right through from hands-on product development and process development, process troubleshooting, through to project management, broader research program management, and also sort of governance roles.
So how did you actually find yourself and pivot into the pet food world? Because you sort of came from the meat industry as such, and then sort of you pivoted in that area. So what sort of brought that along, and what drew you to sort of stay in it more so as your main sort of area?
I fell into it at a really early age. If I'm honest, I'd recently just finished. I did my degree in chemical and process engineering down here at Canterbury. I think I did that with the full expectation that I was going to end up in the petrochemical industry. Finished my degree and then quickly realised that there wasn't much of a petrochemical industry in New Zealand, even less of one now, as it's becoming painfully apparent. But I saw a job come up one day. It said graduate process engineer. I said, well, that sounds like me. And it ended up being working for Mars Incorporated, so one of the sort of the world's largest food and pet food manufacturers. So at that stage, that was actually starting. That was in year 2000, actually, and that was starting at their pet food factory in Wanganui. So kind of since then, I've come in and out. I've sort of spent about half my career in pet food, half in the broader meat industry. But I've always really loved the challenges that the pet food industry offers. It's the really unique technical challenges and actually trying to deliver products that are going to be right for the customers, for the people that are actually buying these products, and just as importantly, the end consumers being the primarily cats and dogs.
I guess you're considered a pet food consultant because you're explaining what you do now is your main sort of area. So what does that mean in practice? Who are you helping and with what?
And again, I say linked into that, really whatever it needs to. It can definitely be getting my hands dirty. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment, completing formulation work. So I should sort of say that through my degree, I started out life as an engineer. Since then I sort of, went on sort of becoming probably more of a food technologist over time. And at the moment, just for fun, I'm in the middle of doing my MSc looking at animal nutrition. So I try and sort of pull all those different factors in together. So like at the moment, I'm doing a lot of different work, formulating products, ensuring that they're going to be nutritionally complete and palatable and digestible, but also then just doing work as well, really understanding, process specifications for people. A big piece of work at the moment has actually been dealing with more international companies too. So, New Zealand's actually got a range of different pet food manufacturing capabilities here, which is of real interest to a lot of international players and international brands. New Zealand is still a long way away. So one of the ways that I continue to help out is I'll actually work in with some of those international brands and kind of be their feet on the ground, if you like, sort of be the day-to-day interaction with sort of some of those co-manufacturers here in New Zealand and support that.
We are so far away, and now I guess with the fuel crisis as such going on, harder and harder for people to send their teams down here, or cost-wise. So that's actually quite brilliant that you are that sort of joiner in the middle and just getting that done as a conduit going through.
I'll build my way through this because I think the important thing is to be making some time for some good questions afterwards. But what I'll look to do today is, first and foremost, maybe a little bit more about my background and that sort of thing, but not too much on top of what we've already discussed. I'll give you very much an abridged history of pet food, kind of how we got to where we are, and kind of broadly what are the formats that you sort of see in the industry today. Who are some of the key players globally and here in New Zealand? What are really key and important global markets? Probably most importantly to people watching, what are some of the key trends that we're seeing here today? And what does that mean then, I guess, for New Zealand? You know, what are our opportunities, but probably just as importantly, what are the challenges that we're going to have to overcome as a nation of manufacturers and brand owners to really be successful in the global market? My background, I briefly mentioned where I started out life. So I started out life working for Mars. Mars is one of the largest pet food companies in the world. Well, it actually is the largest one, and I'll cover that a little bit more later on. I worked there for about 10 years working in product development, process development, and also did a bit of time also in research management, quality assurance, and operations management. I then in about 2010 finished up there, started out, that's when I really probably ended up in the sort of human food side of the market, and actually went through into the meat industry and worked for Hellers. So went into Hellers as their R&D quality manager. And really sort of that was actually quite an interesting time in of itself, because that was at a time where it had grown to a really significant size over the space of 20 years, but had sort of gone from being, if you like, 20 years earlier, the corner store butcher, to at that stage being the largest manufacturer of small goods in New Zealand. So a lot of my time there was about building up a really solid team. I then moved over to ANZCO, one of New Zealand's largest beef and lamb manufacturers or processors, to be their innovation manager. So I spent a lot of time there setting up an innovation centre for them, doing a lot of work really in concept development, prototyping and product development of food, pet food, as well as into nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals. In my last few years there, I took a lead role in setting up a joint venture between ANZCO and Ziwi, and that was me really actually coming back into pet food in many respects at that stage, to actually set up a joint venture manufacturing facility doing air-dried pet food down here just outside of Christchurch. I then spent time at King Country. Again, I decided by that stage I really enjoyed being in that startup phase, and King Country was looking to set up a large-scale pet food extrusion facility based in Taumarunui in the North Island of New Zealand. And that's been a lot of time over the last 5 or 6 years, really looking to actually get that set up, get staff brought on board. I started there in about 2020, actually. It was right in the middle of COVID when I started consulting for them initially before moving on to a full-time role with them. And really, when I started there, it was me and about 3 people. As of the time I finished there was about 80 people there now, and it's a factory which has got a capacity of about 40,000 tonnes a year, all really primarily destined for export markets. So again, what I'm now doing is taking all of that kind of experience and all of the things, and I'm getting to do all the things I love of all of those different parts, and actually doing that in my consulting there under Westlake Innovation. Prepared pet food is still a relatively new thing, if you like, you know. So some of the first prepared pet foods, if I go a real bit of brief history, 1860 is about the oldest thing that I've found in terms of prepared pet foods, and that was this guy called James Spratt who came up with this idea of some dog biscuits in the UK around then. At the top of my head, it was made with some leftover veggies, some wheat, and some blood products. I think one of the things I actually find quite interesting about that graphic is that it's talking about wolves, which has become a real big core selling point for products over the last 15 or 20 years in the pet food market, really trying to sell back to that concept of the evolution of our domestic dog species from wolves. It's also great to see that in those early stages as well, the fact that, you know, pet food was really about trying to utilize co-products, particularly of the food industry, really effectively. Kind of the next big stage then, probably in the early 1920s, we sort of saw some cans really start to come out as being another really core format. That was the Kennel ration product there, which was being made by the Chappell brothers. And then we hit into the 1950s and we start to see extruded products or dry kibble products start to really come to the fore. So that was guys like Ralston Purina and General Mills really sort of pioneering that, which is now, to be honest, today, the biggest selling format globally for pet food. And really then when we look at sort of the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of that evolution has been around how to make some of those formats more convenient has been a big part of it. And obviously, you know, linked into a lot of core for the presentation today, a lot of that's been linked to packaging innovation. So I think particularly in wet pet food, it's been around the opportunity for moving more towards single serve format, whether that be flexi trays, flexi pouches, etc. The chilled segment's a really interesting one, and I'll talk about it a little bit more a little later. Now, chilled, most Kiwis would know, has been around for us for a long time and is seen as pretty much the cheap and cheerful way to feed your farm dog at the end of the day. And it's been around quite a while. It's actually in many other markets, and particularly markets like the US and now evolving into the EU, a much more novel and much more premium format. So, you know, it's sort of seeing a bit of a resurgence, particularly in some of those global markets. I think one of the cool things is that New Zealand for a long time, and chilled is an example of that. I mean, New Zealand for a long time has been really pioneering in terms of new products and formats for pet food. And a couple of great examples of that have been guys like K9 Natural and Ziwi. K9 Natural really pioneered in many respects the idea of using freeze-dried technology for pet food. And Ziwi pioneered the concept of using air drying, or sort of, you know, if you like, jerky style technology for pet food. Both of them in different ways, really delivering really high meat products, incredibly premium products at, to be honest, an incredibly high price point. But that's a really great fit for, obviously, you know, what New Zealand's trying to do as a market, which is not about delivering economy offerings by any stretch, but really just trying to deliver premium products with really high levels of fresh meat that really make the most of our New Zealand provenance story. So on this single slide here, there's probably 3/4 at least of the global commercial sales of commercially prepared pet foods, and over it, it's being done over these 4 different company groups. I've already mentioned Mars, but between them and on the right hand side there, sort of Nestle Purina, that's well over half. In fact, by themselves, it would be well over 60% of the global pet food market between those 2 brands, or between those 2 company groups, I should say. It's interesting as well, they've also got similar approaches. Both are ones you probably know for other brands, you know, Mars being more for things like Snickers bars and Mars bars and M&Ms and Skittles. But it's fair to say that their biggest single company group within their company is actually in pet food. And certainly in the time that I was there, at least, their single largest brand, if I remember rightly, their single largest brand was Pedigree, and number 2 was actually Snickers. So, you know, it's a really core part of what they do as a company. Similarly, into Nestle, obviously, you definitely know Nestle for a range of other, you know, human products as well. But, you know, a really core part of their business is in pet food. You then get guys like Colgate Palmolive, which do incredibly well in areas like pet specialty, doing, you know, particularly the Hills brand in particular. And then not so much over this end of the world, but certainly in the US, Smuckers is a really core company group over there as well. And to be honest, what tends to happen over time, obviously, is different brands come up, become significant, and end up being merged or agglomerated into one of these larger companies. Some examples of the last few years, Royal Canin was an example of that. About 15 years ago, it was bought by Mars for about $1 billion. Another one just recently was the Champion Group, based in Canada, which was making products like Origin and Akana, was also recently purchased by Mars too. So that's what you tend to see over time. You tend to see those larger groups sort of lose a little bit of share and then actually obviously regain it through acquisition. New Zealand's done incredibly well. We've very much punched above our weight as we've gone through all of this. And I've already mentioned 2 of the really key players. And I think as an industry, we've got a lot to thank them for. You know, Ziwi and K9 have done incredibly well to leverage, I think, a lot of the work that, you know, the broader meat industry did. You know, we've done a great job globally around selling the concept of this high quality New Zealand grass-fed free-range beef and lamb. And then what these guys have really done is create formats where they've made those the hero ingredients and have sold very much to do that. And both of them have done incredibly well in the United States and more recently in China. But there's a range of different other brands as well. You know, some of the other ones you might not all know as well, because they're not all sold here in New Zealand, but things like Kiwi Kitchens, the omega-3 products. Kiwi Country is actually one that's sold here in New Zealand. Animals Like Us is a great one. If anyone's interested in really good marketing, I think Animals Like Us is doing a great job of their marketing presentation. And they've got an interesting proposition there where they're really trying to deliver a product that's a hybrid between freeze-dried and kibble. So they've got an opportunity to really drive some of the really high-value claims that you've traditionally seen with freeze-dried, but probably at a a slightly tidier price point than where freeze-dried has traditionally been. Another interesting one just in New Zealand is the old Chef and Champ, which is being made by Kraft Heinz in the Hawke's Bay. I mean, that's going to be an interesting one for a couple of reasons. For really as long as I can remember, New Zealand's the only country in the world where, at the time, Heinz Waddies and now Kraft Heinz owns a pet food facility. It's an interesting fact that that's continued on as long as it has through all the different changes that have happened through it, Kraft Heinz, but I think it's probably just indicative of the fact that it continues to be a sustainable and profitable format for them.
Do you think with the looking at some of the areas shutting down of Heinz Waddies, would that have any impact on them or not really, because that's just the vegetable side of it?
I think it's going to be an interesting watch this space, to be my general thoughts on it. I mean, but I've thought this for a long time. I mean, to be honest, so I mean, I think it's always obviously been a bit of an outlier, and it has been now for as long as I've been in the industry. That's been an outlier for that whole group. As say that not only have they in the last 10 years held on to that investment, though they actually invested in it. Must have been about 6 or 7 years ago. They actually did spend a fair amount of capital actually upgrading that facility. So it'll be an interesting one to see. I'm assuming the fact that it is still there is because from business reasons it's still delivering good profitability. It still must be one that's regularly, I mean, I'm completely guessing here, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's one where they must be asking a few questions, because it's certainly globally, not necessarily a strategic fit in that broader business model. So
yeah, I find that interesting, because we actually have that in a lot of New Zealand companies where they have an outlier of a product they've always done. When they get brought into a global conglomerate buys them out, they've still got that one outlier product or product range or something that they do, and it's always interesting. It seems to be innovative New Zealand way of doing things in some cases, and it's always left sort of the odd one sitting there that doesn't match anything else in the portfolio of the business.
Yeah, who would know at this stage? As say strategically, there's possibly some reasons they might look to divest, but equally, if it's one where they've done capital investment, as say in the last sort of 6 or 7 years, and they're sort of feeling like it's one that's not necessarily going to require significant capital investment in the coming years and is still delivering good return, then they may just leave sleeping dogs lie. And I obviously hope that's the case, particularly for that region, which is doing it pretty tough at the moment.
Yeah, 100%.
So if we then look at what are the key markets that are really interesting to us as an industry, and probably, to be brutally honest, to the broader food industry as well, there's no big surprises. Obviously, there's a kind of our domestic markets, and I always kind of include Australia in that as well. And, we're just seeing good, steady growth in that. I mean, they're established markets. You're not expecting to see really, whoever did these graphs originally has definitely done it to drive a bit of a story. But, to see that kind of 3 to 5% growth is something you're going to be pretty happy with, broadly speaking, at the moment for established markets. And similarly for the United States, it's very much an established pet food market and quite a complicated one, but a good base market as well, and one where New Zealand's done incredibly well. There's no doubt the game in town, and the big story over the last 20 years, I would say, has been China, which has seen exponential growth. There's just no getting around it. And, New Zealand's actually, post our free trade agreement, done incredibly well out of that. So this is just looking at the total market value. But probably up until about 2 years ago, it was a very similar graph for New Zealand-based exports going into China too. If we went back kind of even 7 or 8 years ago, China was almost non-existent. We then saw the impacts of free trade agreement came in, and we got to a stage where probably about 2 or 3 years ago, exports to China actually overtook the US in terms of size of opportunity for New Zealand manufacturers. That very much over the last couple of years has plateaued a bit, and there's been a lot of different factors in behind that. Obviously, some of the sort of the supply chain things post-COVID definitely drove issues. there's obviously broadly that anti-globalization movement, which is still present in many respects in China too. So, you know, we've done well out of it. We've certainly haven't caught too many strays, if you like. I mean, obviously there's a bit of a battle going on there between the big players like US and China, but yeah, New Zealand manages to mostly stay out of that, but it's certainly had an effect. But also on top of that, there's also just been market access issues, and particularly last year we had some real issues post the high pathogenicity avian influenza outbreak that took place down here in the South Island. That put a significant block on exports, or you know, for any export that included any poultry-based product, which is a lot of pet food products, I should say, going into that China market. So all those things together, there's definitely put a bit of a choke on that and on that growth for New Zealand in the last couple of years. There's no getting around the fact it's still a significant opportunity for us.
Yeah, that's interesting. You sort of, I guess, you know, we sort of had those couple of farms that were affected by it, and you didn't think probably that it would impact, you know, something like pet food so much. But then sort of when you say there that, you know, poultry's highly used in pet food, you sort of go, actually, yeah, it is. You know, from what I know from, you know, supplying packaging into the industry, it's like, yeah, there is a lot of pet food, a lot of, poultry in there. So you go, wow. And you just, it's one of those areas you go, oh, yeah, okay. You sort of think of any, you know, selling eggs or embryos or any of that stuff that we probably don't even do that, you know, would have been affected, not pet food. So it's interesting that sort of that has had that impact and affected our suppliers.
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. I mean, it's the same as often happens any time after an outbreak like this. Most other markets really quickly, there's actually a default set of standards underneath, I think it's the WOAH, the World Organization for Animal Health, that basically says, okay, well, there's an outbreak like this. If you've got a product like most pet food where we give it a heat treatment, then it's considered to be a low risk product. So most markets like the US and Australia and eventually Japan as well, turn around and say, okay, well, you no longer say on your export certificates that it's coming from an HPAI free country, but you are saying that you're giving it a heat treatment, everything's fine. So most export markets reopen to us reasonably quickly. China tends to be a little bit different and tends to go through a bit more of a significant process. So there was a whole process really underway last year and really still trying to be resolved at the moment, to be honest, where we had to bring in people from China to complete audits of the MPI processes. And to my knowledge, we're still in the last stages now of actually trying to get that market reopened back up to us, which is going to be incredibly important.
Oh, definitely be important. You know, I didn't realize it sort of stayed on that long. So, you know, what's the sort of timeline looking like that? Do you have any idea when they're sort of considering or is it still just wait and see?
Unfortunately, it's not. Hopefully, it's not quite wait and see. I haven't heard in the last couple of weeks. Certainly, when I was at the recent pet food conference, it was certainly sounding like, I mean, everything was kind of agreed in principle, and it was coming down to the last stages of just agreeing things like, you know, certificate format and wording and bits and pieces. But it's always, at least from an industry perspective, annoying how long things like that can seem to take. But it's just the nature of going through those different regulatory processes. And I suspect, unfortunately, New Zealand pet food's not always necessarily going to be at the top of the list of a person sitting in the China Ministry of Agriculture's office. So it's sort of one of those things we just need to wait for our turn and get that approved, and we should hopefully then be really good and ready to go again.
Brilliant. Be good when it's done.
Absolutely. So look, I mean, no big surprises. If we look at how we sort of look those markets segment out, dogs by far the biggest, dogs eat the most. So it's kind of, you know, no massive surprise there. And again, no massive surprises that cat comes in number 2. I guess an interesting factoid is that New Zealand has got the highest ownership of cats by capita in the world.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
Which, yeah, and it's I've never quite worked out the reason why, but it is. And it is interesting as well when you then start from a store perspective. You know, you get really quite used to the concept that in a grocery store in New Zealand or a pet specialty store in New Zealand, there's almost as much space on shelf for cats as for dogs. And then you go to somewhere like the US or China and it's quite a lot smaller, you know. So there's no doubt, you know, if you're after a volume business, it's certainly export-wise in dogs. I'm a bit of a crazy cat guy. It's actually where a lot of my nutritional study goes, just because I find them actually they're quite interesting from a nutritional perspective, just because their nutritional requirements are actually quite different. But from a market perspective, dogs is definitely the bigger game in town. The other one I think is going to be an interesting one to watch is going to be that other space, and as much as it's definitely smaller and still not necessarily growing at massive rates of knots, I think it's going to be a really interesting one to watch in markets like China. You know, if you're in Shanghai and you've got an apartment that's probably not much bigger than, if any bigger than the office that I'm currently sitting in, then owning a dog is definitely a no-go. Owning a cat's probably still pushing your luck. Definitely, you know, talking to people over there, the idea of owning rabbits and hamsters and guinea pigs and, you know, gerbils and all that sort of thing, you know, they're actually quite attractive because, you know, from a footprint perspective, they're fairly small, but are offering still some companionship as well. So I think it'd be an interesting little market to watch, and one that probably fairly underrepresented in terms of commercialized prepared pet food today. I mean, the big thing where New Zealanders sort of fit in a lot is in functional ingredients. These are the top 5 health claims that are globally seen in the market. Skin and coat's a really common one, whether that's just with supplementation, you know, so things like omega-3, omega-6, manganese, zinc, products like that, or the inclusion of just fatty fish and things like that as for naturally delivering those products. Digestive health, incredibly important, particularly any person who owns a dog would say good stool quality is rather important because you've got to deal with the end outcome. So things like insoluble fiber have always been incredibly important. But similar to, again, that trend in human health, people are really understanding the importance of really feeding a healthy gut. So things like prebiotics, so chicory inulin and products like that have been important for a long time. But now we're seeing much more an evolution into the areas of not only prebiotics, but probiotics, and even now postbiotics as well. And for that matter, natural products that can deliver similar benefits as well. Joint health is important for any senior animal, and as a person who feels like he's becoming more of a senior animal, I'd have to back this one up. You know, things like chondroitin, glucosamine, you know, green lip mussel, New Zealand green lip mussel is an incredible success story. Almost too much of a success story. It's actually kind of hard these days. If you go somewhere like the US, it's almost hard to find a product that doesn't include it. So it then becomes, okay, well, if everyone's using it, then what's your point of difference? So, you know, I think there's actually a bit of a challenge there as well. So it's almost become a bit of a point of entry in that premium space. Immune function, whether that be, again, supplementation, antioxidants, things, blueberries and those kind of products, as well as coming into heart health. It's always been an issue there for cats, but for different reasons, as well as becoming a real focus area for dogs as well. This wouldn't be a pet food presentation without using the word humanization, and I will try and use it no more than that because it's been in every pet food, certainly market-based presentation that I probably would have seen in the last 20 years. And it's not really a trend anymore. It's just the way things are is kind of the way I view it. And by that, it's the concept that, you know, if people have got a cat and a dog in their home these days, they're less likely to just see it as the cat or the dog. They are part of the family. You know, they are another family member. So if something's important to me, and if it was important for me for my children, it's probably going to be important for me to consider for my animal too. So that's really what humanization talks to. And a couple of examples I'm just showing here in terms of photos. This was actually in Shanghai a couple of years ago now. This was actually the company I was working for at the time owned a small chain of cafes where the whole concept was you could bring your dog to them, you could get them dressed up, you could buy all their different relative goods that you wanted to buy for them. But not only that, you could invite all of their dog's friends around to have a birthday party for the dog. And not only that, they had a member on staff there who specialized in actually making dog birthday cakes. So, you know, kind of quite a different level. You know, we talk about humanization, premiumization New Zealand. You know, I think, you know, China's taken it to the next level pretty quickly. But the US also doesn't like to be left out. And I mean, people often talk about the fact that dogs have evolved from wolves. And I sort of say, well, some dogs have evolved further away from wolves than others. These are both real dogs. This was in a show in Las Vegas, actually at Super Zoo. And this was one woman who owned both of these dogs here. So it's fair to say pet grooming's another pretty big market opportunity as well. But you know, some pretty out there things happening with people's cats and dogs. Then sort of look at other trends. Raw and less processed has been a real core one. And as I sort of say, you know, that concept of chilled is definitely not new in New Zealand, but is still relatively novel in markets like the US. Fresh Pet in particular is one of the fastest growing companies in the US, really focused around delivery of chilled and minimally processed products, like the dog roll here, which again in New Zealand would be considered to be a relatively economy product. Over there, very much at the premium end of the market. Could also just be simple frozen products as well. Or then you start to get into, again, products, if you like, similar to what Canine Natural did with freeze-dried, but the example with Tribal there is one where they have delivered a freeze-dried product with no temperature processes whatsoever, and they've actually used high-pressure processing as their mechanism for destruction of pathogens. Because actually, I should say that's been traditionally one of the other issues with minimally processed products, has been the level of pathogens that they can have. And it is worth noting that most of the recalls that took place last year in the US for pet food related to detections for things like salmonella and listeria. And then we also see hybrid style products. Sorry, Steph?
I was going to say that's quite interesting, especially using HPP. You know, if the cost of those machines to put in, they must be making some good growth in the market for them being able to do that with the pathogen free. It's a great claim to be able to make, as you say, with all of those recalls.
I have to admit, people spoke to me first about high pressure processing 15 years ago, and you know, I had to. I've made a mistake, and that was one where I remember them talking to me about it at the time. I was going, "There's no way people are going to pay that kind of money." You know, how anyone? Yeah, by the time you know, look, let's face it, freeze drying is expensive enough. By the time you're considering a product that's got a relatively low yield, then adding on the sort of the costs that are involved with high pressure processing, no way that's going to be a consideration. It's a real core format now in that US market, and there's been a couple of really large investments now. I went through a large freeze drying facility up in Minnesota about 2 years ago now, which all of their product was being high pressure processed before it was going through freeze drying. So it's a really significant part of that market.
Wow, that must be a significant investment, because I know the price of those machines with, you know, one we've got based in New Zealand at Food Bowl. I remember we put that in and running some trials through that with a couple of clients as well, and that does amazing for the product. But yeah, the cost of it was so prohibitive that's, you know, they ran the couple of trials with product going offshore, and that was where it ended, because the end customers like, yeah, it's great, but the cost price is just far too much.
Yeah, no, I kind of got to, I did some work on it probably a similar time to yourself, and I kind of ended up in a similar position. But to be fair, up until fairly recently, there was another crowd in New Zealand that was doing HPP. I'm not sure where that's actually landed just recently, but there is different people actually doing it. And you also then sort of see people actually taking that technology and, as say, taking hybrid approaches to it. So what example happened here with the Stella and Chewy's product is they've actually taken freeze-dried product, they've ground it into a powder, and then they're actually applying that to a traditional kibble style format, which is allowing them to make some of those kind of broader raw claims, but on a traditional kibble product at a much tighter price point than obviously what a completely freeze-dried product would be. What you know in the food industry is very much the same in pet food. So, you know, that the factors, you know, looking for things like compostability, recyclability, you know, they're very much at the core, and not without the challenges, as we can talk about more. But, you know, then obviously getting into it, reducing carbon, or in this case, carbon footprint, but, you know, or water footprint as well, you know, incredibly important. And then obviously also looking things from a product perspective becomes incredibly important, like looking things from a sustainable supply perspective, and also more broadly speaking, a socially responsibility, sort of putting a social responsibility lens as well becomes incredibly important there, particularly in that sort of fish space. But, you know, again, you know, similar story to what you probably see in the broader food industry, a real desire there for recyclability and sustainability of packaging, but also with some real challenges there about how you deliver to some of the requirements around pet food, both from a perspective of, instability, but also even just operational usability.
Yeah, it's 100% the same thing, and it is that whole, the shelf life, the usability of the product. Some products require increased plastic intensity to be able to make those sustainable claims, which again is against how I feel, because we're actually increasing the plastic usage in some cases to be able to say they fit within a recyclable processing. But the product that they're actually using is still mechanically recyclable, but doesn't fit into the matrices of different organizations around the world that run these. So it's quite hard to sort of get that happy mix, as you say, that helps pricing, works on the floor, and then gives the shelf life it needs without contradicting that, which it's hard to do. But it's there's more and more changes happening in that space that can make it work.
Yeah, I think it's a real area of opportunity. Like, again, fully on board with all those challenges. I do look at it and go, if you really made a more sustainable product, if by changing to a completely recyclable non-laminate pouch, say for example in dry pet food, which should theoretically be one of the easier ones to actually achieve it on, if you've done that, but all of a sudden your packaging waste through either your internal processes or through your supply chain, if your packaging and product waste is significantly increased because of that, is your product really still more sustainable, just because the end packaging ended up being recyclable? So I think there's some interesting sort of factors, and I think it's got to be one of those ones where sustainability is really hard, because it's got to be looked at holistically. You can't just go, okay, well, let's be recyclable and therefore we're more sustainable. How are we considering sustainability, and what does that mean for us in terms of what we do from a manufacturing perspective, and as say what that means right through the supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key things as well. I sort of missed that before, but the supply chain is critical as well, because the products need to protect the products that are going there. Because people are down gauging and stuff and using that as they're reducing their plastic intensity. But as you say, yes, then they're having an increase in wastage or stock damage by the time it arrives in the market. So yeah, it's that whole holistic view of the whole lot that's critical, and I'm glad that you actually mentioned it, because a lot of people just don't actually understand that, and they just go, oh no, this replacing this with this gives us what we want.
Yeah, no, agreed. So it sometimes does give you an easy marketing story, but I'd like to think occasionally, hand on heart, it's about saying, hey, I've actually made things better at the end of this. So then that's what I think what we really want to achieve. We've been using plant-based proteins for many years. We're actually probably a long way ahead of the game there compared to the food industry, and I think particularly there, we very much pioneered in pet food things like producing meat analogs and things like that from plant-based proteins, which you're now starting to see in the human food chain. Obviously, insect proteins are coming more and more, but with a similar challenge to what you're seeing in food. It's still pretty niche. It's still reasonably expensive today, with no real nutritional benefits, at least. Not necessarily bad, but not necessarily with any specific benefits that I can see. And the sustainability story, as much as there are some good sustainability stories and behind a lot of it, it doesn't necessarily match up to the price increase that comes alongside that. So at the moment, it's remaining relatively niche. There's some good examples of it in the market. I quite like this one here, the I'm probably old enough to remember Jimny cricket, so I think Jimny's cricket pet food was kind of cool, but it's still very much a niche proposition. Treats has been massive, and again, the last 20 years kind of grown from almost nothing to being a major thing. So, Mars back in the day sort of launching products like Schmacko's Straps and Temptations. I think I still remember, or many in my age group would remember, Dogs Go Wacko for Schmacko's. It's still very much an ad that just sticks in your head whether you want it to or not. And the treats category's grown leaps and bounds from then as well. Again, very much gone through that premiumization to much more natural products today. So that be traditional dried bully sticks, freeze-dried products. They're both products actually made here in New Zealand. And products like the Delectables products there, I go through a ridiculous amount of those with my cat, if for no other reason than it's the only way I can get medicine into her at the end of the day. But that whole concept of treating has become, as I think we've seen that humanization trend. As much as we want to treat our kids, we want to treat ourselves, we want to treat our animals. Personalized nutrition, I think, is going to be a watch this space. I think this is going to be something which I think has got the opportunity, if somebody can operationalize this well, to be quite cool. This was an example here where IAMS actually came up with something where they linked up with the DNA testing business, where they could you get your animals DNA tested, it would then come back and it would make recommendations as to the product off the shelf that would be best tailored towards your animal. Now, to be fair, it's probably being a little bit cheeky at this stage, because it's really saying, okay, hey, we'll do this test, and actually then, by the way, a product that's already on the shelf, here's the one that happens to best meet the criteria for your animal. I think the opportunity is about how you operationally work out a way to actually take information, whether that be DNA, history, breed, all of the other information, feeding history, and then actually specifically tailor products to specific animals. So I think if somebody could crack that operationally, and if people have got ideas, come and talk to me, because I've got some operational ideas about it. I think there's some logistics challenges behind it, but I think there's a real interesting opportunity there to deliver really tailored products for animals.
Yeah, I'm actually aware of, there is one company I know that's actually started doing this as a vet, and she started actually doing it for specific clients, but this is all around probiotics and nutrients for them.
Yep.
So this, I've been talking to her about, how to package this and make it sort of work, but it's quite difficult because it is so niche, and every product she's doing for her clients have actually got different nutritional information that you'd need to put on the packaging. So it's trying to sort of get that happy, and the portion sizing is all different, even though it might be the same breed animal, same sort of weighting. There's different portion sizes based on what the requirements and needs are. So it's quite difficult, and I guess commercialization of that would be tough.
Yeah. So I got some ideas around it, but it's going to be an interesting one, and one that really requires a lot of thought around, what that scaling process would look like. So there's but I think if somebody can crack that, I think that's going to be a real opportunity. And I think you overlay everything I just said, and people want it to be affordable too. We get that, particularly post COVID, all of our cost of living crisis, everything that's now happening, and I think it's an interesting one. I think just post COVID, I remember coming to a couple of different webinars that people were running, and there was this real feeling that we were going to see a bit of a reversal in market, and there's obviously been this premiumization over time, where people, maybe 20 years ago, they were buying their Whiskers or their Purina One or whatever it happened to be, and over time, at an extreme, they'd gone to products like Canine Natural and Ziwi, and there was this feeling that with the cost of living pressures, people were going to almost regress back, and mainstream was going to grow at the expense of pet specialty. That hasn't happened, but I think what has happened is that people still want to make sure that they're giving the best for their animals, but they want to be convinced of that fact. They want to be confident that they're getting value for money. And I think that's a real positive thing, and it's positive for a couple of reasons. I mean, it means that people are really putting their focus in. I think pet food's been certainly not immune to a little bit of marketing fluff over the years. And I think if people ask a couple of questions, I think hopefully that's going to really drive us as an industry just to make sure that, if we're putting products into market, they're one with really good, tangible benefits. So, they may not be the cheapest in markets, but they're at a cost that's deserved and required to deliver a good nutritional benefit. So I think it's certainly a driver, but not necessarily a bad one. New Zealand's got some great opportunities. There's no getting around it. We're sitting here, we've got high quality raw materials, they're highly regarded, and we've got great opportunities for making some really good, strong functional claims from those ingredients. We've got some really strong expertise, both at an industry level, but also, sort of through our research organisations and academia, organisations like the Vet School at Massey. There's some amazing facilities in animal science, particularly through at Massey and other universities around the country. But, and we all know that our clean green image has got its limits, and that definitely shines through now and again. And look, there's no doubt that's been very much at the cornerstone of what has driven a lot of our growth. There's that backlash I mentioned against globalism, and we're seeing that more and more. And China in particular is doing a lot of work to really drive more domestic consumption. So that's something we're going to have to watch. And And look, as much as we want to make stronger and better health claims, that's not an easy thing to do either. Quite rightly, I mean, if you want to make a claim, it should have basis. That's not an easy thing to necessarily achieve. So, as much as we want to do those kind of things, there's hurdles that are involved in getting there.
Recently, you had the New Zealand Pet Food Conference. Was there anything there that stood out? Any innovation that's being talked about? I guess you're right at the forefront of it anyway, so we've probably covered everything there. But is there something there that makes, apart from our clean green image, that makes New Zealand unique compared to global suppliers, and any of those sort of discussions going on amongst your peers at the Pet Food Conference?
Oh, it's not that long ago. I was talking to a US-based customer, actually, and maybe probably answer the question the best. And he actually described New Zealand from their perspective as being what he called first world exotic. And by that he meant it's a place I'd love to come to one day. It's like a Tahiti or a Bali or where have you. It's a place that they've seen in Lord of the Rings is the word he used. It's still Lord of the Rings, but anyway, that's okay. They'd love to come here, so we'll take that. And but the point of difference too is that they also get that we're big enough that they trust that we're going to have solid food safety and manufacturing standards as well. So they see us as very much this premium offering, but one they can trust. And that reputation, I think, it continues to be very much a bedrock of our success in markets like China as well, where there's obviously been over time there's been concerns, particularly around domestic production. So the fact that we're coming out of a country where they can trust our food safety standards is incredibly important. So that's kind of our unique selling proposition, is that we're this exotic offering, if you like, while still being one that countries can trust.
We never have any of our sort of food frauds or any of those sort of things coming up that people complain about, or we get sort of running through the news like you have in other countries where you've seen things happen. As well, myself, when you say that, I've been to a lot of factories around the world, a lot in New Zealand over the years working in the packaging industry, and you do see that difference of how we actually do things. Even though we have to meet these standards, sometimes you go to those countries where they say that's the standard you have to meet to be able to export to that country, and you walk straight into a processing room with your normal street clothes on, and you're like, oh, hold on a minute, where's my hairnet, beard net, gloves, apron, smock, whatever I was supposed to put on? But you're just straight in there.
MPI gets a lot of stick, but we've got to be a lot to be thankful of them of. At the end of the day, they not only hold us to account, but I think that they're seen in the fact that we are going through that sort of regular auditing process sort of imparts a lot of trust in our end products, whether that be food or pet food. Look, it's been an interesting one, actually. I think I haven't actually seen any big quantum shifts in trends, I'd say, over the last 5 years. I mean, and I've been going to quite a few of the trade shows, whether that be through into China and the EU and into the US in particular. And if I've got a gut feeling, I'm kind of expecting to see a little bit more of the same for the next couple of years. So, like, even things like freeze dried, they've come in and they've certainly gained market share, but it hasn't necessarily been. It's been an evolution rather than revolution very much going on. You're seeing kind of hybrid products coming in and things like that. But, nothing that sort of, I haven't turned up and went, wow, where did that come from? It's sort of been very much evolution of those trends. I do feel like, I think there's an opportunity there. I don't know exactly what it is yet. I think, there's an industry, it's an industry that's ready for a bit of disruption. I do feel like that. I don't know exactly. I wish if I knew what that disruption is, I definitely wouldn't be telling you what it is, because I'd be doing it. But it does feel like an industry that's ready for some disruption, and whether that's going to come in the opportunity for trying to deliver those more tailored products, or whether it's going to be, in other ways that we can probably involve the customer more. I think it'd be an interesting one to see, even just from a packaging perspective. I mean, we've been putting dry pet food into bags for many years now. We've been putting, cans into cans. Cans is actually a kind of an interesting one from a packaging perspective, because when I, again, very much started in the industry, the general belief at that stage was that cans was a dying technology. There was every expectation that flexi pouches and flexi trays were going to be the future. Everyone was sort of very much trying to exit out of cans, and you've sort of seen very much a re-emergence of cans in the last sort of 10 years. in markets like China, they're actually seen as anything being more premium. So particularly the little sort of single serve 85-gram cans and things like that. And obviously in broader terms as well, they're just easier to recycle, though they're seen as being anyway. So, cans have certainly had a bit of a renaissance, to be honest.
So when you were at Mars, they were that's where they moved away from that into the pouch format, for all the single serve pouch formats. And that plant there used to hum with all of those going through there.
But that was where the Canary Wodonga, why would we spend money on that? Because that was technology that was going to fall away over time. Future was very much in flexi pouch, flexi tray, all that side of things. But like for, I think, right. And look, I mean, there's also no doubt that cans are still a cheaper way of feeding your cat or your dog as well. And I mean, 100-gram pouch is not that particularly useful for a dog. So much for most dogs anyway.
So what do you think about flexible packaging specifically? Where does it show up most here in the pet food, and where do you see other opportunities for it? I guess you sort of touched on it a wee bit, but what do you sort of see as key for improvements in that?
Most commonly, obviously, in dry food, and be that it could be kibble, freeze dried or air dried. So that's where we're most commonly using flexible packaging. Obviously, also in traditional chilled formats like dog roll. Dog roll casings, and incredibly important part of our market, or particularly our domestic market. Obviously, also laminate retort pouches, and there's, off the top of my head, only one manufacturer in New Zealand at the moment still doing laminate retort pouches in New Zealand. Obviously, most of the rest is, or all of the rest is actually being imported into the country. Unfortunately, that facility that was in Wanganui has since been shut down. But yeah, so look, I think the other key formats, I think the opportunity is very much linked to what we were talking about before around, how we might look at getting things recyclable in all of those. And I think there's challenges in amongst all of those to actually deliver that.
And it comes down to that shelf life and, protection layers in it. But I mean, there is advances in that, so we can sort of get closer to that. But again, you've got to look at that end market where you're targeting and ensuring that the product you're doing suits that end market for the packaging wise, because it may be recyclable in New Zealand, recyclable in Australia, but then going elsewhere. And again, sometimes it's not recyclable here, but it will be over there as well. So you need to understand all of that. And I think that's one of the things that people miss as well when they're talking about sustainability. But I mean, I've working in this industry for a while, I sort of feel that in the flexible side of it, that the pet food industry has always been the most innovative to make changes, because they're trying to do things out there to change it, to make it look, to make them stand out, so it's not just another kibble on the shelf. And you mentioned Animals Like Us with their branding. They've got all their bright colors and how they do those at the shows and everything like that. That's just a great way of doing something different with the same sort of packaging that's been used traditionally for quite a few years in that space, and they've done it really well. Non-negotiables for pet food packaging, is that you simply have to get right, because I know there's we're pretty good here in New Zealand, but I know there's other cases where there's been stuff that's just gone horribly wrong.
Packaging something, when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. And it'll stop your factory. And given almost all of the packaging that I just talked about is going to be imported, because very little of that for pet food. In fact, I really honestly can't remember the last time I used a New Zealand-based flexible manufacturer. I've used New Zealand-based suppliers, but it's all been actually sourced from overseas. So the lead time for replacement stock, obviously, can then start to have some pretty severe supply chain consequences. So if you get it wrong, you might be staring down the barrel of even air freighting it in. It might be 6 weeks at a minimum before you've got replacement stock, which completely leaves you dead in the water if you've got anything close to a just-in-time delivery model, particularly through with grocery stores, which don't necessarily tend to be particularly understanding, I should say, about empty shelves. So I guess the big thing I would say is anytime people are going to be looking at packaging supply, make sure that you've got local support and make sure you've got local technical support, so that something will always go wrong. I mean, like it's one of those things. Over time, there'll be a problem. So just, you want to deal with a reliable supplier that you're confident, hopefully that's going to be minimized, but like anything, eventually there'll be a problem of some description, and it's the ability of a supplier to locally support you through that when those situations do occur, both to hopefully maybe help you manage it through your own process, and also drive resolution to the issue as quick as it reasonably can. That's going to be possibly the difference between you staying on shelf and not.
You do see where stuff just goes horribly wrong, and it might be something simple that's just caused it. I've been in cases where a halal plant, this is in food, a halal plant, they changed from non-halal to halal. They also at the same time changed their format. Everything was focused around the format of the packaging, and the ingredients listing still had pork written in it. Just as they went to commission this plant, and everything luckily they had a little bit of buffer stock. But you're right, even with a New Zealand manufacturing company to get the replacement stock processed, because it was a laminate, still took 6 weeks. How do export requirements and regulation influence packaging choices for New Zealand pet food brands?
Not too dissimilar than for food. I mean, it's pretty, generally speaking, our requirements are set down by MPI, and broadly speaking, they just point to US FDA or EU requirements. So broadly speaking, we're just looking for certification, from our supplier that says that they're comfortable that it meets that relative, I think it's CFR 21 or whatever it is, and saying that it actually meets those requirements. So like most food or pet food manufacturers, that's about as far as we would go. And we're just ensuring that it meets those requirements. And there's not any other requirements that I've come across too much that most importing countries put on us from a packaging perspective, as long as we've met those requirements.
We're seeing a few changes and minor changes in requirements for specific stuff to suit the Japanese market, Indonesian market. This is on the food side of it. But generally, based on what is being manufactured, it sort of sits already in those levels. It's just they're just tightening theirs up. So it's quite interesting seeing that, and we were wondering if that's going to carry on across other countries as things progress. Again, with that whole way of stopping globalization, or who knows why they're doing it, lifting their standards. And so from that as well, so we've mentioned MPI there. So do you feel that our standards truly on paper are better than what you see in other countries, or is it just the perception of it?
I think our manufacturing standards are certainly one of the highest in the world. And as you say, I've been to other countries, and we won't name names, but I've been to other countries which certainly put high expectations on us, where certainly you go in country and you, as you say, you're going in, and this is a human food as well, and you're not getting change before you go in, and you're going into effectively a ready-to-eat environment, and you go, where was the red line? So it's I think we definitely have higher standards in that regard. I mean, I think there's an evolution in that over time from other countries, but I think we should still be proud that our standards for manufacturing are still really, really high. In terms of other I couldn't talk to broader packaging standards. I know that you'd know far more about that than me.
We've talked about where to look at the packaging there. So I was sort of going, where would you sort of tell someone that's a new startup or similar, where's the point they should slow down and make sure they've got everything right before launching into something there in the pet food industry?
I think it's very much making sure that you have sat down and thought about that whole supply chain. I think would be the biggest one. But also, we're all at risk of falling in love with our solution. I think this is, if you've ever done design thing or something like this, is something they talk about a lot. But we come up with this idea and we really love it. We're really passionate about it, and that's cool. We should be. But have we thought about the problem that we're actually solving? And I think that's a really important question to ask. As you're going into a new business, or even in an existing business, putting a new product into market. As I say, this is a really crowded market. It's really hard. It really is hard to sit down and to look at a pet specialty shelf and go, what is it that I can put on that shelf that's actually going to be a point of difference? And you can kind of tie yourselves up in knots going, oh, okay, what am I going to be able to do that's actually going to mean that this store is going to actually list my product over another one? And you quite often get to a point where the easiest option is to say, well, I can work out how to give the store more margin than anyone else. to be blunt, that's the simplest and easiest way to actually get it onto shelf, is to tell the store owner that by selling your product, they'll get more margin than by selling the other guys. That's also a little bit of a downward spiral, arguably, if your product is otherwise the same as what's already on shelf. So the challenge I always put to people is, okay, when you look at what's already on shelf there, what's the problem that your product solves that nothing else already does? Because if you can do that, you've by definition got a differentiated product, and you're the one actually solving that product, and people are going to want to put your product on shelf. Yes, they're still going to want to make sure that they've got a reasonable margin, but you want to have a product that solves a problem that no one else does, because then a store is going to want to list your product because they don't want to be at risk of not. So
yeah,
yes, that's the biggest question I would always ask. I always ask people right at the very start is, what great, you've got what looks like a cool solution there. What's the problem it's solving?
A lot of people don't think about that strategy side of it and targeting that sort of blue ocean area where they can sort of clean sail out into it versus fighting in the red ocean. So it's quite interesting that you say that, because it's probably one of those key points that people do miss, because a lot of product is, as you say, it's just same but different.
There's times where its price is definitely going to be a part of it. There's no getting around it. True in all markets, and certainly true in pet food. But it's going to be difficult to make that a sustainable advantage, particularly for any product that's being made in New Zealand.
Is there a question about pet food or packaging you wish people would ask you more often about?
The first thing is still very much thinking through that supply chain, and that one's that is the one area that, as long as they have thought through and that they're comfortable, they've got a differentiated product, then my next follow-up to that is, okay, great. What is your supply chain into market? What are you looking to do? What is going to be, what is that going to look like, or your pathway to market? So, where is it going to go? What country is it going to go into? Is it going to be going through into physical stores? Is that going to be grocery, pet specialty? Is it just going to be online? Are you going to be going through distributors, et cetera, et cetera? And then, okay, how do you tailor your proposition to best work for that? So product's going to be part of that, but this is actually where packaging becomes the single biggest part of that discussion oftentimes, because it is about saying, at its simplest, it could be saying, well, you're trying to deliver a very specific price point. So it might be a decision around, okay, is this a 2 kilo product or a 1.8 kilo product, for example, because you're trying to deliver to a specific price point. It could be you are trying to deliver a specific height, because obviously that's the shelf height that you've actually got to deal with. You could be considering, are they looking for shelf-ready style packaging, and the examples that I've talked about in the past, products going to Costco, for example, where, effectively you are palletizing directly onto shelf-ready packaging. So, okay, that poses a whole another set of challenges as well that you need to be able to work through. So I think making sure that you actually thought about all those factors right ahead of time solves a lot of pain later on, because otherwise you get to the end, and if all you've thought about is what's going to run well through your factory and conceivably what's going to be the best for your customer, that's the times where you often see the issues that, either A, you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, we're getting this really poor container utilization, which is really expensive, or actually you've seen it before as well, where products end up somewhere like Walmart, and Walmart just suddenly look at it and go, well, no, that doesn't work for us. Not interested.
Guarantee that some of them have light bulb moments there and just go, oh my God, we didn't think about that. Because, you've gone into great detail there about what's required. And I can just imagine some people just going, uh-oh, that wasn't even a thought about it. Didn't think about shelf-ready cartons, didn't think about this, didn't think about that.
It's just about making sure you've had the right conversations with the right people, and look, cards face up, I don't consider myself in any way to be a packaging expert, but that's when you actually bring in people who are.